This is a short introduction to the art materials that you're going to be using in the first part of the Art 11A class, with an emphasis on pencils, because in the first few weeks we'll be drawing almost entirely with line and with pencils. Let me start by talking about paper. Um, I have some things that are apparently still at PCC that I thought I had here. So I've asked you to buy an 18 by 24 inch, which is a little larger than, I have an 18 by 24 inch pad sitting in front of me, but it doesn't all fit in the camera setup that I have here. And that a sketch pad, white drawing paper would be the main thing to purchase. And in fact, the only thing to purchase if you're trying to economize. So I have a couple sheets of an old drawing pad that are on the background here. And I have, as a stand-in for the relatively inexpensive white sketch paper, simply some laser printer paper. It's not all that different from the white sketch paper, except that it tends to be thinner. So you want to think about the physical characteristics of the paper. Back to my question, why does paper matter? This is a fine art, studio art class, so that's going to be kind of the bias. If this were a class that were in digitally based drawing, and that was the primary thing, then paper probably doesn't matter very much, because you're very possibly not making something for a final destination that is a piece of paper. Or if paper does matter, it has to do with printing techniques. It doesn't have to do with the unique object on which you made the drawing. So if you're going to make a drawing that ends up in an animated film or a video game, or as an element in a graphic design on a web page, for example, the paper isn't that crucial. But if you're making a drawing as a unique work of art that ends up, for example, in a frame, on a wall, in a gallery, or in a house, then the paper not only influences the way you draw, but it really influences the look of the object. The paper actually becomes part of the artwork. So one of the things you want to do is sensitize yourself to the differences in paper. And there are many, many, many kinds of paper available. Very fancy rice papers, and papers that have designs already in them, and extremely thick papers that allow you to paint with water-based media without warping the page, and all sorts of colors, textures, etc. So for starters, just this simple white sketch paper will work, but I'm also asking if you can afford it, or at some point in the class, it would be great to get some of the drawing paper. And you notice right now one thing that I think you can see on your screen. They're not the same color, and not all papers are the same color. And this kind of ivory tone of the drawing paper has a very different look in relationship to the mark you make with your pencil or your charcoal or whatever it is than does the more neutral bright white. And then you can get all kinds of other papers, as I've said. So for the very first assignment where I'm asking you to experiment with things, please feel free to use whatever paper you have hanging around. If you've got a grocery bag and you want to draw on the grocery bag and see how the materials work on that, please feel free to include that as part of the assignment. All right, so the thickness of the paper matters, the color of the paper matters, and the texture of the paper matters. The texture of the paper is usually referred to in terms of something called tooth, which means that the paper that has greater texture is able to have little divots in it that allow soft materials like charcoal to get caught and stay better in the page. So A paper with a lot of tooth is really good for things like soft charcoal or pastel. Sometimes you'll see papers that are say they have a smooth surface, or you'll get papers with names like Bristol board or ledger paper that are very smooth, and those can be good for other things. Those can be really good for drawing with pen and ink, for example, but they wouldn't be so good for the materials that need to sort of flake off and stay inside the paper. And even the drawing pads that I'm asking you to at least consider buying, you sometimes will see a smooth surface or a medium surface or a rough surface. I would get the medium surface if they have one, or don't get the one that's identified especially as smooth for our purposes. But for some drawing purposes, that's great, and it is what you would eventually want. Okay, you should have all received a letter from me before the class began that had a simplified materials list included in it. If you didn't get that, please go on to Canvas and look under announcements. I posted the letter, the very first of the announcements that's there. You should be able to find a copy of it. Also, I posted a written materials list that's a little bit more extensive. It's under assignments, and it says course materials, and it talks about some of the individual elements, as I'm going to do right now, some of the types of things that I'm asking you to get. In the initial letter, I said, let's keep it simple. You can get these inexpensive prepackaged drawing kits online and for pickup at art supply stores, and that is absolutely fine to get you started. So I will mention a couple of things here that probably aren't in the kits. Don't lose a lot of sleep about that. You can get things later, and in most cases you could probably get by without them, but they're nice to have if you can afford them and you're motivated to get them. So let's start from the beginning. Well, I just ordered this. This is one of these kits. This came from Amazon.com. I think that it cost me approximately $23 delivered. There was a little 10% coupon, so that more or less covered the tax. I have no idea who the company is that makes these. These are not the super high quality. It's a zipper. I'd opened it, but it has a zipper, which makes for a nice, easy to store, easy to carry group of materials. It has a small sketch pad. You can even see this sketch paper is a little bit of a different color. It's kind of in between, right? The two colors. It's closer to this one, but this will be useful for some things. This does not substitute for the larger sheet. I do know that it sometimes is a pain to draw on a larger sheet, but I have my reasons, and we'll talk about that. But essentially, it's about making your drawings more of a kind of a public communication and less of a diary in a small sketchbook. Nothing wrong with the diary in the small sketchbook, but we want to think about what happens when you make something that's actually visible for a distance and is kind of asking to be looked at. If you're able to control the elements of mark and tone and shape and the arrangement within the composition in a larger sheet of paper, it's relatively easy to scale that down to a smaller sheet. It's not as easy to scale it up. And we may talk more about this, but this is why I'm asking, in a nutshell, why I'm asking you to draw on what might be a larger scale than you're comfortable with. So let's look at what is here in this kit. And they're not all identical, although most of them have similar things. This is actually one of the larger ones. You can get even less expensive, less extensive kits. All right, we have graphite pencils. So, and this is a graphite pencil over here as well. And so graphite pencil. You'll notice that these pencils are coated. These are just soft, medium, hard, but these are charcoal pencils. You often will find the same codes on charcoal pencils as well. If you go to an art supply store, you will. So what are these numbers? What do they mean? The letter H means hardness. So if you have a 2H, it's a relatively hard pencil. If you have a 5H, it's a very hard pencil. The letter B, think of the word black, stands for black. So if you have and also it's the softness of the pencil. So if you have a 2B, it's a relatively soft pencil. It's definitely softer than that 2H. And if you have a 5B or a 6B, this one even has an 8B, which not all of them will have one that goes that soft and that low. It's the softest of the group. What's the difference? Why do you want a soft pencil or a hard pencil? Why don't you just have one normal pencil? These HBs or Bs or Bs and HBs are going to be the closest to the kind of pencil that you're used to using to fill out Scantron forms and things like that. So here's a pencil. Well, this is a 4H pencil. This is from another brand. That's another one of these kits. What you'll see is that the 4H pencil makes a line that is sharp and that is relatively light, or it's possible to make a very light line with the hard pencil, the 4H pencil. Possible to make it so you can barely see it. Why would you want to do that? That is really useful when you're laying things out on a page, when you're trying to find the relationships of shapes, and you know that you're still working on that, and you don't want these lines necessarily to show up very much or at all in your final drawing. In fact, these are lines that become relatively easy to erase as well, so they can just totally disappear. But also you can go in with a softer pencil. This is now a 4B, and if you've decided you like that, you can draw a much more vivid line, right? And you make something that is actually a lot more substantial, a lot more visible, right? If I make this imagine this little sphere, right? And so the soft pencil, the B series pencil, in this case I'm using a 4B. The differences are not huge between 4B, 5B, but it's nice to experiment and see. There is a huge difference between 4B and 4H. You see how this starts to become darker, right? So you want some kind of hard, soft, medium pencils available. You'll use the hard ones probably a lot less, but they're really useful when you want to do something very precise, and particularly when you want to do something that's light and flexible and easy to erase. So these are the graphite pencils in this kit. This is a woodless graphite pencil. Let me just pull it out. A lot of kits won't have this, and it certainly is not required, but it's kind of nice. I hope you can see. So your typical graphite pencil has a thin channel of graphite inside wood, right? And this is what you're used to in a pencil. The woodless pencil is solid graphite. It just has a plastic wrapper on the outside. And so they often make the woodless pencils in softer, high up here in the B series, hardnesses or softnesses, I guess you could say. And so what will happen there is that you'll be able to cover larger areas with darker marks. So it can be really a pleasant way of drawing. It won't hold that very sharp edge that you will get with the harder pencils, but you see it appears to be much darker, and it's also capable of covering much larger areas more quickly. So I think if you find yourself enjoying drawing with graphite pencils, you owe it yourself to yourself to try out some woodless pencils, particularly ones at the very soft end of the spectrum. They're just a really pleasant drawing experience, but again, not required. But it's nice that they included one in here. And you can, of course, get those in various hardnesses as well. And then these are charcoal pencils. Now, why are we going to want charcoal pencils if we've got these nice graphite pencils? Well, you're going to see, even with the softest, blackest graphite pencils, there's a real different look. The charcoal pencil is much blacker, so you get a much stronger contrast with the paper, right? So that there's a graphic power to charcoal that you don't get from graphite. Graphite is nice. Graphite is easier to control. Graphite is easier to have a sharp edge. It's easier to erase. But it always has that kind of silvery gray look, and it isn't as bold as the charcoal. Plus, we're gonna quickly get to using compressed charcoal, so the large areas of a drawing can be blackened in or grayed in or rendered in a range from highlight to shadow. And it's just much graphically bolder. It's really frustrating sometimes for people right away because it's messy. But once you start to see the results, particularly when we get to the part of the course where we are dealing with large areas of light and dark, you're going to understand why charcoal is desirable. So just at first, we're going to work with these charcoal pencils. It's nice to get some soft ones and some hard ones. In this case, they just have 3, and they're listed as soft, medium, and hard. That's perfectly good to get us started. Otherwise, with pencils, there are lots of different brands. If you get really interested, you can go and see what happens if you get the more costly ones as opposed to the ones that come in the kit. And you can get, relatively exotic ones. This is one no, it's not. This is one I got in China, and 14B, which is really unusual, and it's, very nice dark mark. That's that. Along with pencils, you're going to need erasers. You're going to want a little plastic eraser like this is, and I'm guessing what's under here. Oh, this is a little sharpener, which you're going to need sharpeners. I'm just looking at this, on screen here sort of for the first time. It looks to me like this is sort of color coded to be a sharpener that you identify with the graphite pencils that have the blue barrels. And then there's another one over here, which is perhaps better for the charcoal pencils. Charcoal pencils are a pain to sharpen. They can break very easily. They can be a real pain if they get dropped. I mean, this is true for all pencils, but it's especially true for charcoal pencils. That if you take one of these, it's got that channel of soft charcoal in the middle, and you drop it on the ground, or you drop it on the table or on the floor, it can break inside the pencil. So you go through all kinds of problems to get it sharpened just right. Sharpen. You start to draw, and then click, the tip comes off, and you sharpen, 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 and you start to draw, and click, the tip comes off again. And it's basically shot because it's broken inside the wood. So handle with care. I think this is why they put this knife in here, because one way of sharpening charcoal pencils is with a blade, and you can actually whittle down the wood. And then this thing is a little board with peel off sheets of sandpaper, so that once you kind of roughly cut the pencil to a point, you can then rub it on here and get a more precise point. I don't have with me, but I recommend a brand of handheld pencil sharpeners that comes from General Pencils. This is a General charcoal pencil. You see this brand in a lot of stores. And I think it's called All Art, something like that. It's red. And the best one to get is one that actually has a little round container that catches the shavings. Not terribly expensive, and it works nicely with charcoal pencils. When a lot of the other sharpeners that you might try are maybe a little harder to deal with charcoal pencils, and it can be very frustrating. A thing that people have used with success are eyebrow pencil sharpeners with charcoal pencils. Also, and this is going to depend on your finances and on your general commitment to drawing as an ongoing practice, you can get electric pencil sharpeners. I have one here. That's how I get points like this very easily. And they will do a great job, but they plug into the wall and cost a bit. And then they have various versions of those, little battery powered ones that I don't have a lot of experience with. And there's also a couple of brands of crank pencil sharpeners that can clamp to a table and have a mechanism that sort of grasps the pencil and then draws it in, that can work really well with charcoal pencils. So perhaps we'll talk about this some more. If anybody has questions for me, you can write them in the discussions or actually bring them to our Zoom meetings. So pencils, erasers. You're going to want plastic erasers. This is one. You see how this can really make a relatively light mark almost completely go away, and I just smeared that with my finger. I have a little brush here, which is a nice luxury item, but you see already how charcoal can create some frustrations. And it will help take the charcoal up too, as long as it's not too black. Now, erasing, you're never going to get all the way back to the absolutely pristine paper, but you can definitely get close enough to kind of get the effects that you want in most cases. Another kind of eraser that you want, and that I see one here, is called kneaded eraser. Gonna look something like this. I see one that's, you can see here. And it's kneaded with a K, like bread. And what you do is kind of warm it up, you stretch it, and then you can shape it. And so then if you have something that you want to erase that's fairly precise, you can kind of come in and shape very specific areas, or if I wanted to pick up a little highlight here on the edge of this, I can do this way. So this can be very useful, especially with graphite. So a kneaded eraser and a plastic eraser. These plastic erasers, you can either rub to get them clean, or cut with the knife to just reveal a new clean area. Or with the plastic erasers, actually, you can even wash these. You could even, go with a little dish soap and a sponge or something, and wash or dry them off and get most of the stuff clean there. Okay, that's erasers. That's pencils. Blending elements. What you see here, these are called rubbing stumps. Have a couple here. So these can be used to blend and grade. Now, sometimes people like to use their fingers. The problem with using your finger is that it can actually affect the drawing because of the oils in your finger. So I'm not saying don't ever do that, but it is an issue. So these rubbing stumps, some people love them, some people find they don't use them much. They do come with a lot of these. They're quite inexpensive. I mean, basically what they are just a tube of tightly rolled up paper. And you can buy things like this that have a whole bunch of them of different sizes. I don't recall what I paid for this, but it's wasn't that much. Other thing, this is one that's really nice to have in this class, particularly when we get to a certain point where we're dealing with light and dark. But if you're on a super tight budget, you can get by without it. You can use a paper towel or something. It just won't work quite as nicely. It's what's called a chamois. They do make non-animal based versions, but typically they are an animal skin. These are the same kind of things that you see in auto supply stores that people use to rub down the surface of car finish. And here's one that's been used with charcoal, and what happens is we have the ability to smear and cover areas in gray or black, and that turns out to be really useful later on. I generally, when I use one, I'll just leave it like this because that's kind of the job I have for it, is to smear charcoal. But I am told that there are ways to kind of wash these and restore them. I'm worried that they would become too stiff, but this actually has the word washable right on its description. So if you want to try that, let me know how it works. You might be able to go online and see somebody who's giving instructions about the best way to wash one of these. So chamois is the way I've always heard it pronounced. It looks like chamois d'artiste, but nice to have, not absolutely required. Another blending tool along with the rubbing stumps. Okay, so we've talked about pencils, we've talked about sharpeners, we've talked about charcoal pencils and graphite pencils, and we've talked about blending materials. So the big other thing, these that are in this kit are actually compressed blocks of graphite. That's not something that I'm asking you to buy for this class, but you might find it useful when you're trying to cover larger areas with graphite. My personal choice to doing that would be the Woodless pencils. And so these are compressed charcoal. I'm gonna see if I can find some existing compressed charcoal. So here's one that's, again, like those, soft, hard, and the thing about compressed charcoal is you can really cover large areas. You can make really kind of bold statements. So that's the hard one, and if I drag with the same pressure on the soft one, you see how it's a little bit blacker. You also see how the word, I don't know if you can see on the screen, but where I wrote the word graphite pencil, it's kind of coming through. There's a little bit of a kind of oil and water effect that happens if you try and draw with charcoal on top of graphite. So most of the time you don't want to do that. You want your drawing to either be in graphite or in charcoal. However, feel free to experiment, including with this very first assignment where I'm asking you to experiment with the materials. What ultimately matters is the result. If you get the result you like in the drawing, there aren't hard and fast rules about what materials you use and in what order. There are a few cases, particularly with painting, where there are some things you really don't ever want to do because it will stop the painting from ever drying and things like that. But with these materials, you know, the worst that's going to happen is you just don't like the look. So compressed charcoal, very important. Get some of that. I think almost any one of these kits will have enough of it to get you started. So I think that's pretty much it for now. I did mention the blade that came with this. If you have something around the house, it's going to be helpful, not only for trimming the points of charcoal pencils, but we're going to do at one point a little exercise where we need to cut a window in a piece of paper or a card fairly precisely. So if you have a conventional fumbling around here. Yeah, an X-Acto knife like this, that's great. That would be ideal. If you have something like this old-fashioned box cutter that just exposes the corner of an old-fashioned razor blade, that's fine. Utility knife, anything like that, if you have one of those, that would be really helpful. Again, we'll work around things. If you don't, I don't want you to have to spend a lot of extra money. But if you're home, those are things that are actually handy, I think, to have in the house, and many of you may already have. I'm not requiring, and in fact, sometimes I'm going to discourage use of rulers and things. However, if it comes to cutting, another thing that you might want to use cutting for is to smoothly cut the holes off the edge of a drawing when it's been pulled out of a drawing pad. But this kind of, well, for our purposes, it would be better to have a larger one, but this kind of ruler is great, where it has, I don't know how well you can see it, it has a steel cutting edge on one side, and then it has a tapered, sharp edge here that can allow for a, very straight line. Now I'm going to basically ask you not to draw with a ruler. I want you to be looking at things and actually seeing and responding to the shapes that you see more than I want you to have an accurately straight line. But rulers and straight edges for things like cutting can be very useful if you happen to have them around. There are other things I'll be asking you about as we go, that you're going to want to figure out and think about what do I have around me where I'm living. Little props that we're going to use to look at and make drawings of, for example. All right, I've gone on a little bit longer than I had planned. We'll have a chance to talk more about this in our Zoom meeting and via our discussions if there are any further questions. I hope this is somewhat useful to get you started, and enjoy that first assignment where you get to play. The early assignments in this class are mostly quite specific. Do exactly this, don't do that, use this. This one is not. This one is giving you a set of very wide open to interpretation instructions, and I want you to think about how do you follow those, how do you organize those on a piece of paper. I think that we will see a lot of different solutions from different people in the class, and that's what I'm hoping for. It's not that there's some right answer that I'm looking for in terms of how this looks and how it's organized. Just do it.